lot of moisture, but can also tolerate some drier conditions. And that would be, sycamores are really great, bald cypress. And again, that combination, that diverse trees, shrubs, and herbaceous. You can start building in your color. A lot of these perennials and herbaceous plants are great for your pollinators. And so building that into your buffer is also an option. And then kind of more on the top part of your buffer, once you start going up that stream bank. So along the top edge of your buffer is where you're going to have moderate to dry soil. And so you're going to want to plant species that are more adapt to that type of environment. So this is where you see your red buds, you see your sycamore in there again. So it can be in both of those zones. Silky dogwood is great. Little blue stem is a grass we've had a lot of great success with. And then one thing I like to note about this section is this is the section that is closest to the land use, right? So we're up off the edge of the stream and we're up on the bank now. And so this is your section where if this is the view shed, people can see this from either the roadway or your back window or as they're walking towards the stream in the park. And so this section is your opportunity to plant a lot of those really colorful species and show intention and get your swaths of color in. And so building in a lot of great colorful perennials is a good idea for this part of your buffer. Okay, so like we mentioned in selecting plants, you want a diverse selection of native species, and that getting that combination of wetland, moisture tolerant, and then moderate to dry tolerant plants. And when you do that, when diversity is key here, because you're really building in the ability for your buffer to sustain itself. Like if something came through and knocked out one of your species, you still have a bunch of other species there to help fill that space in the future. And then obviously in plant selection, you want to take into consideration sunlight and shade, and also consider if you're planting trees, they may be, the other plants around it may be planted in the sun for a while, but then once those trees and other shrubs grow up, they're going to start providing more shade to those areas. So your buffer will change over time. All right, some really great planting references for riparian buffers. Like I mentioned many times, UK Cooperative Extension Service has some great materials for planting a buffer. There's this Planting a Riparian Buffer guide, which really gets into some of the details of how to plant and how to plant, seedlings or trees. And then they also have the publication Living Along a Kentucky Stream. And then my personal favorite that a lot of the information here is based on is the Central Kentucky Backyard Stream Guide. This is a great resource. And if you just Google UK Cooperative Extension Service ID 242, it'll pull this up and they have a PDF version of it that you can access from home anytime. And it'll walk you through the steps of your backyard stream and getting a buffer in place. And then the last reference for planting that I wanted to mention is the City of Lexington has a really great program called Plant by Numbers, and they developed, for streamside buffers, they developed 6 different planting guides based on your different sunlight conditions and your color. Like if you want a lot of color or you want a lot of greenery. And so this image is just an example of their sunny streamside garden with a lot of color. And they, they give you an example of a planting layout and they give you the different plants that are associated with those numbers. And then they have alternatives as well listed on there. And so it's a really great resource, and those are available on the web link that you see on your slide, on your screen. And again, I mentioned there's 6 of those. And if we have time at the end, I can pull up some of these references just to show you all. I have those reserved in another window as well. Okay, so part of planting your buffer, most people are going to run into undesirable plants. So whether that's honeysuckle, if you're looking at invasive species or non-natives that you don't want in your buffer, a lot of the projects we've worked on have dealt with Johnson grass and having to battle Johnson grass and out competing a lot of the natives that we've planted. And they're just not as effective as at erosion control. So yes, there's vegetation along the bank, but the preference is to get that native vegetation in that's really going to grow deep roots and hold your banks in place, and be a benefit to the community. And so controlling those undesirable plants is essential to establishing a healthy stream buffer. And there's many ways to do that when you go in to remove invasives. And, if you do not want to apply herbicide, you can obviously go in and do stump removal, which is very intensive and high labor. Really all invasive removal is, but, pull by hand if it's a bit of a smaller, honeysuckle, if it's, smaller than you and you can pull them by hand or rip out the winter creeper. But then herbicide control methods, cut stump. If you're looking at honeysuckle and it's over an inch in diameter, a lot of times they'll take the glyphosate. Obviously, you want to follow the directions on the spray, but a lot of people will add dye into that. So they, you cut the stump and then you apply the herbicide immediately after, and that's a really effective way. And they apply the dye so that they know where they've hit already. So anyway, lots of different options. I would recommend the Kentucky Woodlands magazine. They have a lot of archived information from their forest health articles on removing invasives. They have videos and detailed, articles on what to do and different steps and approaches that you can take. So that's another really great resource, because like I mentioned, a lot of times when we're working along our stream banks, we're going to be battling and dealing with invasive species. Okay, another big thing with respect to our stream banks and our buffer zones is stabilizing the stream bank. So ideally, you have a 3-to-1 slope of your bank or less. So that it would be if you were to go out, horizontally 3 feet and then up 1 foot, that's going to be a 3-to-1 slope. So that's your desired slope of your stream bank, or even flatter, so that it can continue its access to its floodplain and have that access, and then give your plants a chance to get their roots in that bank to hold it in place. But if you have really steep slopes and you're having to really get in there and get into permitting and all that, it's worth it, but it's just something that can be costly and require permits. So it's just something to consider. And then also installing erosion controls when we get started. And if we remove all the invasives, we really want to start off with a good slate. And sometimes if you have a lot of bare soil, you're going to want to install a natural fiber erosion control blanket, and that's really going to help hold the bank in place until your plants can have a chance to establish and get their roots into that soil along the stream bank. And then oftentimes we recommend mulch even on the top part of your bank where your perennials or moderate to dry plants are, just to really help try to control weeds in that area as well, so that you're maintaining that nice look of your buffer. Okay, so sources of native plants. A lot of times there's all kinds of different sources that you can pull from, and we've used several of these with some of our community projects. But you have options, obviously the natural seed bank to your stream. If you're lucky enough to have more native than invasives, there's a chance that there's a lot of native seeds in your stream bank already. And if you just let it grow and you don't mow it, they'll start coming up. There's also seeds and getting native seeds for seeding your stream banks that way. Starting with perennial plugs is always a really great economical option because plugs are going to be a lot cheaper and you can get a lot more of them, and they are easier to naturalize as they're not so used to being in a container. But the only problem we've seen with plugs on some of our projects are if it's a community project where there aren't people that are, you know, they can't be continuously dedicated to always checking on the plugs or making sure that they're doing okay. You can lose a lot of those plugs in the weeds. You know, if you weren't able to, you know, kill off all the grass beforehand, they can be confused depending on if the maintenance crew wasn't trained properly or not. And so I just caution, plugs are definitely an awesome option and an economical option, but maybe they're a lot better of an option for maybe your backyard stream if you're the one that planted them and you can weed around them and really, you know, care for them and make sure that all of your plugs have a chance to be successful. So that's just kind of a disclaimer there. Bare root tree seedlings or whips are another great option for trees. And those are very cheap and also a great economical option. You know, if it's not a huge community project where you would be worried about someone mowing them down, they're a great option for getting a lot of trees in your buffer as well. And they're just a lot smaller but will grow. Live staking or cuttings is when I talked about the black willows, that's an option. So cutting those willows and then sticking them directly into the buffer is also a great source of native plants that way. And then containerized trees and shrubs. So whether that's quart size or gallon size, you can look at a lot of different options on containerized based on your budget and what you can afford. So we've had a lot of great success with the quart size plants because we can keep the cost down, but they're a bit larger of a plant than a plug, and so they really start growing quickly after they're planted in, you know, May timeframe, and so they're not confused as easily with other weeds or something that might overcrowd it easily. But obviously that's going to depend on your budget, on the size of container that you can plant, and you know how big your buffer is. And be sure to ask if your plants are free of neonicotinoids because they can be harmful to pollinators as well. So this is just an image of, this is taken from that backyard stream guide. This is an image of all these different types of sources. So you have willow live staking on the very edge near the stream. You can see that the grass has been pre-treated before they started this planting. They're planting little plugs right now, but they also have containerized shrubs and even a ball and burlap tree. So there's lots of, you know, you can mix and match all of these sources as well. And when you're getting into a project like this, especially a community project, it's a great opportunity to get the community involved. This is a school group that's working on planting over 800 plants along this spring. And the kids did an awesome job with this project, but it's a variety. It's plugs and mostly plugs in a quart size plants, and then a couple gallon size trees as well. Couple is probably an understatement, more like 30, but it's a really great project, and I have some pictures of it as it's grown as well. And but getting that community involvement, getting volunteers involved in planting is a great opportunity because hopefully you can loop them in on maintenance as well, which we're going to get into, and that's a big deal. This is another project with a lot of the same similar sized plants that were planted, plugs all the way to quart and gallon size. Mulching around them was a big help, but in this situation, it would have been ideal to lay some sort of blanket down to help. This is a project that we've been battling Johnson grass, but they had a lot of awesome willows right along the bank that have helped to hold it in place as well. You can see they're mulching along the top to try to help create that delineation between the mowed park and the buffer itself. Okay, when you're looking at costs of your buffer, you want to consider a lot of different things. So you're going to have the cost of the plant material. You're going to have the cost of any erosion control material. So if you want to install some sort of blanket or erosion control blanket, which I always suggest, it's just such a great start to your project. If you need to spray an herbicide along the bank to kill off whatever's growing there before you start, there's different types that are safer along waterways, like Aquamaster and a couple other ones. But if you really don't want to use an herbicide spray, you can also smother the grass using a tarp or cardboard. There's a lot of different options that you have, so you don't have to do that. But if you're dealing with some really tough invasives, it may be something to consider, or if you're just having a hard time getting the grass. So anyway, lots of different options with that, but that would play a role into your cost as well. The cost of any mulch, if you're having to hire labor or rent equipment. If you want to do educational signage, which is always a great idea for your borders of your buffer, just so people know why you are doing this project, what is the buffer doing, how is it helping with stormwater, all really great opportunities. And then any slope stabilization. So all things to consider when you're putting together your budget. And this image is just a sample budget for, you know, a project that we just kind of made up, but it's a very similar budget to other projects that we've done in communities. So it's it might be a fake budget, but it's very similar to other projects that we've done. So some constraints to your buffer, and we're almost done and can get to questions in a second, but you will want to consider the supply of native species or plants that would be suitable for your buffer. So what native nurseries will have with respect to what you want to plant. So the Kentucky Native Plant Society has a really great resource for native plant nurseries. If you just type in Kentucky Native Plant Society and look up their native plant nurseries guide, and I have that pulled up as well and can show you, but that is a really great resource for finding native plants in Kentucky, and they have a lot of disclaimers from, you know, the different nurseries that sell native species. So that's a really great option to you know, overcome that constraint. Also appearance. So, you know, if you really want a wild and woody buffer, you know, you may have some constraints with what you can do in your community or you know, depending on where you live. Or if you want it to be a bit more intentional, if you want it to be a bit more manicured, those are all things that you would consider during that plant selection process and planning out your buffer. And again, that weed ordinance, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, but strategic planning of that, like masses of color or masses of swaths of very similar plants throughout your buffer, will really show intention and purpose. Adding that educational signage along the edge to show people why the grass and the plants are taller along the stream bank, etc. And last but most certainly not least is maintenance. Maintenance is going to play a big role into the success of your buffer. So obviously you want to inspect your stream regularly, get out there at least seasonally, and after storm events, you'll want to go out, remove any litter that may have been trapped by the vegetation that's there, and just kind of inspect it. Maybe plan once a year a time that you're going to go out and remove invasives or spot treat for invasives. You'll want to prune any trees and shrubs that you've planted as they grow. And then once a year in late winter to early spring, that like March, April time period, you'll want to remove the previous year's growth from your perennials and your grasses. And then obviously take pictures and share information about your buffer. But like I mentioned, having people dedicated to the maintenance of your project, especially when you're doing a community project, is going to be key to the success of it. It's just that is a buffer's downfall or its success. So making sure that you have people set aside, and if it's volunteers, making sure that it's a group or, you know, a group of people that are dedicated to taking care of the buffer. All right, well, that is the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to A, answer any questions, but B, if we have some time at the very end, I can share my other screen and show some of those resources that we talked about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay. All right. So we actually do have one question. Lisa asked, what do you recommend is the best replacement for bush honeysuckle?
When you are removing bush honeysuckle, any of the things that we have talked about, any of those plants, and I'll kind of go, because I have a specific one in mind, but button bush, you can see it's the middle on the slide, and the top images is the middle one. Button bush is a really great native species that will do really well along a stream bank. And even black willow, just trying to think of like similar size things that might help take over. And in the meantime, to try to crowd out once you've removed the honeysuckle, maybe getting some other levels of plants and some native grasses. That soft rush does really well, just to try to get those roots in until your bushes get big enough.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions? Lindsay, if you wanted to show those resources, go right on ahead. I think that everybody, we don't have any other questions. So and we have a few minutes left. If anybody thinks of anything, though, in the next 6 minutes, please go for it.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to switch screens and I'm going to present that new window just so people can check out a couple of those resources. So can you see, looks like it's pulling up. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So this first screen is the Kentucky Native Plant Society's webpage. This is the one I mentioned where they list where to buy native plants. And it lists a lot. We've worked with Dropseed before, but it has a great resource, and it has disclaimers that says they also carry other species that could be invasive or exotic. So just to be careful, ironweed has been one that we've worked with. It has the Kentucky Division of Forestry's tree seedling program. Oakland farm trees we've worked with. Roundstone is a great source for native seeds. So like I said, there's Springhouse, Wilson's, a lot of these are in central Kentucky as well. And so even goes cross state for some sources for our friends that are more on the border. So anyway, this is a really great resource for natives. Next that I wanted to just pull up is Lexington's Plant by Number. Like I mentioned, these are the STREAMSIDE layouts that they have. So I'll pull up you saw the full sun colorful. Here's like the partial shade lush. And so it's based off of the different types of sunlight conditions that you have and maybe the color options that you want. And like I mentioned, they provide alternatives. So let's say you can't find white baptisia. And so they have, you can also use small yellow, or, it's a really great resource for someone that's maybe never done a planting plan like this before. And maybe it's just to give you inspiration. Maybe you don't use everything, but it's a good inspiration style to use for starting your buffer, and just kind of seeing how other communities and individuals lay out their buffer. And then there's also some other great information on that link as well that I gave you, which if you just search Lexington, Kentucky plant by numbers, it'll pull it up. And it has some other stuff at the top, but if you scroll, you can eventually get to those STREAMSIDE layouts. I also mentioned the invasive plant information from the Woodlands Health magazine. And so here's the link to that, to forestry.ca.uky.edu, and invasive plants. And they have all kinds of guides. And if you click on it, it pulls up all the information, and you can click on the Kentucky Woodlands Guide here, and it'll pull up the whole article. So it's great. And this web link is to actual videos of how they've worked to remove invasives and the different methods that they use. So these are some great resources as well if you're dealing with a lot of invasive species in your area where you're wanting to plant your buffer. And then the last one that I wanted to pull up is just the UK Cooperative Extension's Central Kentucky Backyard Stream Guide. This is a guide where a lot of the information from today's presentation was gleaned from, and it's just an awesome resource that I encourage you to check out, and it goes along with a lot of things that we've discussed today, and it's just a great resource. I'm going to leave it on the front cover just so you can kind of see who wrote it and who's worked on it, but just search UK Cooperative Extension ID 242 and that'll get you to where you need. So that's the last thing I had. I really appreciate you all joining us today, and I hope that this was some helpful information for everybody.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for presenting all of the fantastic information. I know I feel better educated, and don't forget, if you haven't already, you can still register for our next 2 water webinars. They're coming up next week on the 14th, and then the following one will be on the 21st. Next week, we will be talking about rain gardens, and then on the 21st, we will be talking about sustainable lawn care. So yeah, if you all have any questions, feel free to email us, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.